My name is DeAndrea Bolden, and you are tuned in to the Faith and Mental Health Podcast. Listen, guys, to those that are tuned in, as always, I have an amazing guest, and I'm going to allow her to introduce herself. Let the listeners know who you are.
I am Crystal Currie. I'm a licensed mental health therapist. My niche, my vibe, it is transgenerational trauma. I facilitate two workshops and conferences throughout the year, the Cycle Breakers Conference and Reparented by God. I am so excited to be here.
Awesome. Listen, this is a very important topic for me because as somebody that is, I tell people I'm a church baby, born and raised in the church. Trauma has become a buzzword in the church. However, I don't really think people understand what trauma is from a clinical perspective. And I also don't think people understand that it can be almost, I'm trying to think of the right word. It can be also almost counterproductive trying to deal with trauma and unpack trauma with people if you're not someone that is skilled in that area. So even that said, every clinician is not equipped to really handle people that have a lot of traumatic experience that are dealing with complex trauma. And so I have to say that because I always tell people just because somebody is a therapist doesn't mean that they are qualified in every area. Just like every doctor is not a surgeon. Every doctor is not a cardiologist. There's specialties, there's different training, there's different expertise that people have. And that's important to know so you understand the limitations. I've had to tell people over the years to make sure, I always tell people therapy is not a checkbox. I'm excited that we have people excited about therapy, but we've turned it into I got a therapy, I've got therapist I went this week, but you're not getting better. You're still in the same space. The purpose is for you to resolve and address the issues that you have, to evolve and to grow and to reach your goals and objectives from in a mental health capacity as a person. And if that's not happening, I tell people fire your therapist and find another one. You don't let people just bill clinical hours just because. You have to make sure they're a good fit for you and vice versa. So with that said, I want to dive right in, as you see, to what is trauma. I want people to just, first of all, because we're also dealing with I'm triggered, everything triggers you. And, I've had to tell people every negative experience does not mean you are dealing with the aftermath of trauma. So you didn't win a trophy. That does not mean that you have PTSD. Like there's a certain thing called disappointment, letdown. So I want you to dive in and let people know, what is trauma?
Yeah, so trauma, simply put, is a situation or event that was stressful and you did not have the ability to cope with it at the time that it happened.
Nice.
That's it. Very simple. Yeah, and when you mention triggers, a thing that I tell people is no one is responsible for your triggers but you. And so oftentimes when we say like you're triggering me, what we're doing is we're saying to a person, hey, you're more responsible for managing this trigger than I am. So it's a way to avoid, and it's an excuse for not dealing with it yourself.
Whew. Well, that put it into perspective. We have some responsibility. I like that. I like what it's important, and I want you to dive to, and I didn't even anticipate going this way, but what you said made me think of something else. Emotional intelligence. Can you kind of segue what you were talking about as far as emotional intelligence? Because I found that it may sound funny or whatever. I find a lot of people lack in the area of emotional intelligence. A lot of people haven't really matured and really grown in that area. Can you kind of talk about that for a second, since you were talking about triggers?
Yeah, so one key component of emotional intelligence is self-awareness. And your self-awareness is your ability to look in yourself and say, hey, these are the things that I'm doing that are not working for me. And these are the things that I'm doing that are not working for the people around me. And so when you have high emotional intelligence, you're able to be accountable to yourself about your own behaviors and about the way that you think and how your behaviors and your way of thinking impact your daily decisions and your interactions with people. So people who don't have very high intelligence don't don't have a lot of self-awareness, and so they tend to project and make excuses for their behavior and almost
Mhm.
always take this victim mentality, like I did it because you did something to me, instead of saying I did it because it was a decision that I chose to make.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I think that's a conversation a lot of adults. I feel like a lot of relationships, and this isn't even talking even so much romantic relationships, just relationships in general. I
Yeah,
feel
yeah,
like a lot of relationships in general could be repaired,
yeah,
or could be healthier
yeah.
if people were more self-aware and
Mhm,
not always trying to deflect on others
mhm,
or playing the blame game and stuff like that.
mhm.
And thank you for talking about that. But I want to dive back over into
Sure.
to those that don't listen. Listen, she that made me think of something, but I think that's important because I do think to some extent when people are dealing with a lot of trauma, they can lack emotional intelligence. So I do think that I don't think a lot of times that connection is made directly, but I
Yeah.
think when you deal with enough people and you see a lot of people that are, it's easy to tell when someone is overstressed,
Mhm.
easily agitated, they go off at the fly of a hat, but they always blame other people. And so
Yeah.
sometimes people can two things can be true. You can lack emotional intelligence and personal accountability, self-awareness, and you can be dealing with the aftermath of trauma. But I want to dive right back into trauma, and I want you to give some examples of what trauma is, because I found that some people that really were traumatized didn't realize it because I didn't know. So
Yeah.
I want to talk about some examples that people may experience that could be traumatic. Yeah.
Yeah, so my niche is childhood trauma. So I'll give some examples from that. So if you grew up in a household and you really weren't sure who was going to be responsible for your care that day, if you really weren't sure how you were going to eat that day, if you often heard your parents fuss, if you often heard your parents talk about money or financial strain, if you were parentified, meaning that you were the sibling that was responsible for other siblings, or your parents made you responsible for their own emotional health, that is very traumatic. If you were in a situation where you were molested or sexually abused,
Yeah.
that is traumatic. If you felt like in your household you were not able to communicate how you felt, for example, if you said, I feel depressed, and your parents said, go depress them dishes, that is traumatic.
Yeah.
If you were in a situation where you felt unsafe with the neighborhood that you lived in because people were getting hurt or killed, that was traumatic as well. So trauma can be very small things or it can be very big things, but most people don't realize they've been traumatized if it was very small. So we call those little T traumas, like it was accustomed to not have enough to eat, and so because you think that that was
The
because it
norm.
happened so
Mhm.
often, you didn't think it was so traumatic. And because the
Yeah.
people around you in your neighborhood didn't have a lot of food or a lot of money, you may have thought that it was okay too, but it was traumatic. Mhm.
That's good because I'm glad you brought that up about like neighborhoods and environment, because I do talk about things like food scarcity,
Mhm.
no running water, no utilities, living in a violent neighborhood. A lot of young people, especially in certain low income neighborhoods,
Yeah,
loved ones getting shot and killed, maybe even witnessing it,
yeah,
different things like that. Um, I want to talk about, since we're talking about childhood trauma, I want to talk about some of the other traumas that come with parents. I want to
yeah.
talk about some of the more direct parent trauma, as far as absent parents, parents that are dealing with addiction, parents that may have passed away, parents that are incarcerated, growing up in foster care, bouncing from home to home. I want
Mhm.
to talk a little bit more about those things because I think those are also, unfortunately, I guess those would be considered bigger things, but in some scenarios, it almost seems common. It just seems
Yeah.
like the breakdown of family has made some things become more common that really shouldn't be. So I want to talk a little bit more about childhood trauma directly tied to parents.
Yeah. So the thing is that people do what is familiar, not what is healthy, right? So when we are parented by our parents, they are unconsciously and unknowingly just doing to their children what was done to them, right? So if you had like a parent who didn't have who didn't grow up in a two-parent household, they are more, research shows, susceptible to raising their children in a one-parent household because that's what they know, and that's what they're familiar with. So a lot of children who grow up in one-parent households have a lot of trauma because they experience the financial stress, the strain that comes with just having one parent. And then especially if your father was not in the house, research shows that the child feels like the father chose something over the child. So the father may not be in the child's life, but they may have a very successful family somewhere else across town, or they may have a successful job somewhere across town. And so the child is feeling like, okay, well, what is it about me that made my father not pick me and pick something else? So they grow up thinking that they need to add titles and accomplishments to themselves to make themselves feel more worthy, of being chosen or picked. And then a lot of times, um, children can be left with mothers who can be very upset or strained because of the situation that they've been left in. And so the child feels like responsible to make sure that their mom is happy, or that they're not in the way too much, or they're trying to make sure that they're as helpful as they can be by cleaning or washing dishes or taking care of the siblings, to make sure that they make it easier for their parents. And then if you have a parent that's addicted, they are not emotionally or physically available, or they are very inconsistent. So you never know what type of parent you're going to get, which causes you to be on edge. So similar to children who grow up in physically violent or domestic violent households,
Yeah.
they start to look at parents' behavior. So they'll listen to footsteps, or how a door closes, or how a cabinet
Yeah.
closes, or a tone of voice, to figure out, okay, what parent am I getting today? And is this parent safe for me today? And so the
Wow.
constant need to be on edge and be alert, becomes very traumatic, for that child.
Wow. I saw some research years ago. I can't remember. I think one of the researchers, I believe, was an MD. This has been years ago,
Mhm,
so I can't remember all the people involved. But they were talking about how people that are in lower income neighborhoods are more likely to experience multiple
mhm,
traumatic experiences than people that may be in a higher income bracket. And I
mhm,
think that that is very, very important for a lot of reasons. Poverty itself is traumatic. I don't think we understand that just growing up in poverty by itself is a
mhm.
traumatic experience. So even if there were two parents there, even if they were, loved and, well fed, sent to school, and, the parents did the best they could, and they were, adequate parents. Poverty
Mhm,
itself is traumatic, and
mhm.
you talk about that financial strain. I don't really think a lot of people understand what growing up in survival mode
Yeah.
does to people and what it
Mhm,
causes them to become
mhm,
in adulthood. um, I want you to talk a little bit more about another thing I wanted you to kind of touch on is, and I want to get into is people that have parents that are mentally ill.
yeah.
I don't really think we talk about that much enough. Parents that are growing up with, or children, sorry, that are growing up with parents that may be bipolar, that won't take their
Mhm,
medication. There's research that shows that people that are bipolar have a high likelihood of not being compliant with their medication. Parents that may be schizophrenic, people that are dealing with serious mental illness that makes it hard for them to parent and to be what their children need. I think that's something else we have to look at when we talk about childhood trauma. I want you to talk a little bit more about that, how that affects people when they grow up like that. They grow up in a hoarder house.
yeah.
That you see some of those hoarder videos, and it's like, my gosh, like kids had to live like that. I
Yeah.
remember somebody, this is a true story. Somebody I knew that worked in a certain school district was at work one day, and the kids were doing something. I can't remember what it was. And the kid was like, well, let me get it out of my bag. And like something off a horror movie, a flood of roaches came out of, I'm not talking about one, two, I'm talking about they had to fumigate the whole building because it was as if somebody put a 5-gallon bucket of roaches in this backpack. And so to imagine that a child is living in infestation, houses full of rats, houses full of roaches and different things. That is traumatic. And so I want you to talk a little bit more about the effects of poverty and the effects of dealing with a mentally ill parent that is not fit. I'm just going to be honest. There are some mentally ill parents that are not fit to have their children, and it is not a very good outcome.
Yeah. So, yes. So, poverty in itself is more traumatic and has more negative outcomes than child abuse. Because when you don't have those concrete needs met, it's really hard to build or to develop a emotionally sound, emotionally intelligent child. Because who can think of anything else when they're hungry? Who can think of anything else when you don't have running water? Who can think of anything else when you're moving from place to place? Like there are some kids who they leave for school on a Tuesday morning and then they come back Tuesday afternoon and they don't live there anymore. And this is their life, from day to day to day. And so when I used to do a lot of community work, that would be it. That the parent would put the kids on the bus at 8 o'clock. I would get a call at 11 o'clock saying they had to be out within the next hour because the sheriff was at the door. And so this was the frequent
Yeah.
moving of displacement of children. So it does become very traumatic because you don't know there's a disruption in housing, food, water, shelter, all of those things. So it does become very impactful. And then you do have the children who are children of parents who are, who have those severe substance abuse. I mean, not substance abuse, but mental health. And it becomes even more convoluted within a lot of cultures that really downplay mental
Yeah.
health. So it's not
Yes.
that, Uncle Johnny has an anxiety disorder. Uncle Johnny just nerves bad, or, where has cousin Sheila been? She just, went away. Cousin Sheila has been in the hospital, psychiatric hospital for the past 6 months because she
Yeah.
tried to, commit suicide. And
Yeah.
then you have these families or these cultures that really downplay and hide mental health. And so the children grow up and they start to have symptoms and they think that something is
It's
wrong with them
normal.
because nobody ever said anything,
Yeah.
And so they end up doing the same thing that their parents did because they don't know that they had a predisposition to this or it was
Yeah.
passed down to them. But these children ultimately become very parentified themselves and they become very self-sufficient and they have to detach from their parents who have these severe mental health because they cannot depend on them. And so you grow up with children who are literally just raising themselves
Yeah.
but there is a parent in the home, but that parent cannot be a parent. And actually the child is being a parent to the parent. So it becomes very disruptive to their, development. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that was really good because one thing you said when you talked about the children developing the same symptoms, I have personally seen
Yeah.
people listen to someone have a diagnosis and say, I have the same symptoms. There's nothing wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
And I have found that people will normalize it
Yeah.
if because at the end of the day, we know that mental health is emotional and psychological well-being. We know that a mental
Yeah.
health disorder is it affects, thinking, behavior, and
Yeah.
emotions over time. And
Yeah.
so if you don't realize something is abnormal, it becomes normal. It
Right.
becomes the norm to you. And
Yeah.
I don't think we address that enough. How you said, realizing like, hey, you're predisposed because
Yes.
you have a parent that that has
Yes.
bipolar 1 disorder. You have a parent
Yes.
that's paranoid schizophrenic. You have a
Yes.
parent with major depressive disorder.
Yes.
And so when people aren't being told that, I
Mm-hmm.
feel like they get blindsided.
Yep.
I feel like people get blindsided, and I've learned, and I'm still learning. I have a master's in counseling, and I used to do substance abuse counseling. I had my state certification, but I'm in the process of pursuing my terminal degree.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I've found is mental health is so complex. It's
Yeah,
so complex.
it is.
There's so many things tied to it. That's why I really push for an integrative approach. That's why I'm really
Mm-hmm.
big on holistic health,
Mm-hmm.
because we can't just look at what's wrong with you. We have to
Mm-hmm.
look at the why. And I
Right.
find that most people that have turbulent adult lives can trace it back to their childhood. I
Yep.
find that a lot of people that have struggled to find their footing in life as an adult can pinpoint it back to their childhood. If someone can sit down with them, and you'll find that some people, everything was good until they were 6 years old, then this happened and it just threw their
Right.
whole life off a
Right.
trajectory. I
Yeah.
like to look at pictures of people when they're growing up, because
Mhm.
sometimes you can see when they stop smiling.
Yeah.
You can see when the
Yeah.
sadness sits in. And
Yeah.
then I know some people, some things I feel like in school weren't taught.
Yeah.
I feel like I learned a lot more counseling people that
Mhm.
were in various stages of addiction and recovery than I did
Mhm.
from the coursework. And I
Right.
find that, sometimes when people start dealing with a lot of mental health issues, it starts being pronounced in their
Yeah.
physical appearance.
Yeah.
And you don't really hear a lot of talk about things like that when you're going through the your courses and stuff like that. But I think that stuff is important. I want you to I see we got a few minutes left. I want you to talk a little bit more about childhood trauma. I want you to talk about the ACE, the ACE scores
Yeah.
for those adverse childhood experiences. I'd like for you to talk about that. I'd like for you to even talk about any patterns that you've seen.
Yeah.
Or I'm big on observing things. I've learned that again, APA don't have all the answers.
Right.
I do believe, especially when you talk about being culturally competent, I do
Yeah.
believe that there's some things as being women of color or black women that
Yeah.
we can pick up on and recognize that people that are not from our community they would dismiss it, or
Right.
they wouldn't recognize it, or that they would diagnose it as something. It's like I remember this lady said they were trying to say that this woman had a mental health disorder because she kept doing this. She was like, she's patting her weave. Like, you
Yeah.
could have sent this person that just had a baby
Right.
to level 8.
Mm.
And so even the same thing with mental health. So I'd like you to talk about the ACE scores. I'd like you to talk about any patterns you've seen, even culturally, and different things like that.
Yeah, so the ACE score is an acronym that stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it's a very common assessment that therapists use to try to figure out, like, how traumatized were you?
Yeah.
How many traumatic events did you experience growing up? Because when adults come to therapy, they know something's wrong, right? But it's really hard to kind of trace it back because in some cultures and some families, what they experience was normal. And so sometimes as a therapist, you have to look at them and say, hey, like, based on this ACE score, based on this assessment, what you went through was not normal and it is impacting you. So, for example, like a lot of clients that I've seen have very large gaps where they, in time, growing up, that they don't remember. So I'll be like, okay, well, tell me about fourth grade. And they're like, I don't remember fourth to sixth
That's so
grade.
important. Yeah.
I don't remember that. It's like, okay, so let's talk about what happened in the third grade, and they talk about their life. And then it was this huge event that happened and they were in survival mode from fourth to sixth, right? And then maybe some relief came in seventh grade. And so that's like a key thing that Also, when it's very funny because clients will laugh when they're telling like a very traumatic story. And often laughter in therapy is a way to kind of feel better about the difficulty that they experience. And so I was just asked, like, well, what is funny about getting
Yeah.
beat around the house with the
Wow.
extension cord, right?
Yeah.
What is funny about that? But it's just a way to cope. And so that's a pattern that I observed. And
Wow.
then two, a thing that I observed is like clients will either like try to, it's like the boundaries. Like I'm putting up all these boundaries because I just don't want to deal with it. Right? Boundaries is a way for you not to deal with something sometimes, as opposed to like, I'm just doing what's healthy for me. Because they just don't know how to deal with disappointment, opposition, and like resistance. They don't know how to deal with it because they just don't have or haven't had the emotional capacity to do so.
Yeah.
So those are some patterns that I've noticed.
No, thank you for taking the time to explain that and to share. I think this was a really good conversation. 30 minutes really is not enough for this to really
Right.
unpack childhood trauma and for people to really understand not only does childhood trauma follow you into your adulthood, but it affects everything from your basically your life outcomes is what I'm trying
Yeah.
to say. It affects your life outcomes as far as your success, your functionality, your ability to survive in this world, and different things like that. And so it's a lot to it when we start adding in environmental factors and all type of other things. It's just a lot. And so I want to say thank you so much for coming on here and talking about this. This is the first time I've ever had anybody come on here to talk about childhood trauma.
Oh, wow.
I've been doing this podcast on and off for years,
Uh-huh.
and this is the first time I had someone talk about this topic. But childhood trauma, look, I tell people you're not going to get out of this life unscathed. You're going
Yeah.
to experience something in this life that is unpleasant, that is traumatic, that
Yeah.
is upsetting. You're not gonna make it out this life unscathed.
Right.
We're all going to experience something, but it's important that we're able to recognize it, get help when we need it,
Yeah.
and to help try to resolve some of these issues. So what I want you to do is to please tell people where they can find you.
Yeah.
Anything you have available, books, events, anything coming up, share all that stuff. Share your social medias. Let people know where you're licensed to practice. I don't know if you're on our directory, but if you're not, I'm going to add you. So just I'm going to pop you up on there against your will. So if somebody's in your state, they can reach
Yeah.
out to you, because I love what you're saying. You know your stuff. You've dealt with this, and so you get it, and so
Yeah.
that matters to me.
Yeah. Okay, so you can find me at Crystal R. Currie on all social medias. You can go to my website, crystalcurrie.com. You can purchase Cycle Broken t-shirts, hats, and stuff. I also wrote 2 intentional forgiveness workbooks because people say you just need to forgive, but no one tells you how. And so it is a walkthrough on how to forgive people that don't want to be forgiven and have not apologized. And so I also do workshops throughout the year that you can register for. There's a podcast on my YouTube channel, Crystal R. Currie, about childhood trauma and healing from it. And I am licensed in North Carolina. I own a group practice. So if you're looking for therapy and you're in North Carolina or South Carolina, you
Okay.
can reach out and we will get you connected that way.
Love it, love it, love it. Listen, I hate we're out of time. I'm gonna have to be nosy and get on your website when I have some time. But I love it. She's down there in the Carolinas, definitely a place that I love. And so thank you so much to everybody that tuned in. Thank you, Crystal, so much for being
You're
my
welcome.
guest. And like I say every time, until next time, God bless.